I think the industry as a whole, with the $1.3 trillion target on its back, I expect to see some fireworks, more automation, and a lot more attack surface with AI, government information colliding with other government information, and secrets being let out that shouldn't. On the people front, you're going to see a lot more sophistication and speed. A lot of these things are going to become quicker, faster, cheaper, smarter for the attacker, and they're going to get their hands on a lot more data.
This is GabyCast.
Are they completely cyber
As a primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is security and testing and performance and scalability.
Risk and compliance.
We can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me now is Christine Gadsby, Chief Security Advisor at BlackBerry, and today we're discussing why mobile espionage is a critical national security threat in Australia as well as globally. So, Christine, thanks for joining me and welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's sort of set the scene a little bit here, Christine. Mike Burgess, who's the Director General of Security in Australia and the Institute of Criminology, reports a conservative yearly loss to espionage at 12.5 billion Australian dollars, which most would assume is attributed to organised cybercrime. And although using mobile and online tactics like romance scams, fake investments that we've seen, etc., it's driving dramatic growth. So I really want to walk through some of your thoughts. What's coming up in your mind when I ask you this question?
So first off, he was spot on. Nation states are spying and doing lots of crazy things at unprecedented levels with unprecedented sophistication. He also warned that ASIO is seeing more Australians targeted more aggressively, really than ever we've seen before. But the important thing to note here is modern espionage, kind of as you and I have known it in the past, it really no longer needs that, mole in the room, or, we see in the movies, the bad guy with the briefcase, changing hands on a park bench with a parka, over his face. That's no longer how we do espionage. Now you just need a phone with some free messaging apps that, are leaking your metadata in an unsecured environment. But I guess more importantly, you asked kind of why this is happening. Mobile communications are opportunistically currently one of the weakest links and kind of a gold mine for an attacker. If you think about it, we have a combination of many incredible things happening in the global audience right now. And that is, you have telco networks themselves. Think about all that technology that we use to connect a mobile cell phone call with. If I call you and you're in Australia, think about the path that call takes. One device to another, all of that infrastructure and technology is really old. So when you think about what's worse there is you have areas of the globe that are still really dependent on not only that outdated technology, but also are still on 2 and 3G networks. So you have kind of this combination of insecurity connected to insecurity connected to insecurity. And that infrastructure itself is so old, some of it's unpatchable. So in the security, industry, as security practitioners, we know where vulnerabilities are being exploited. And if you think about that, it's sort of like your laptop or your computer. When you get an update for something that has all those security fixes, when you make a phone call, those updates sometimes aren't possible for parts of the infrastructure. And those are known to be exploitable. So you've got this group of sophisticated attackers. They know how to exploit this technology, and there's no way to fix it. So many in the industry, including governments, respected security researchers, we all are having these conversations where we admit it's just not fixable, which is kind of scary when you think about it, right? So you've got this system of how we connect, and you've got it under attack. And then you add on top of that, really this new espionage kind of gold mine of attackers running businesses. They are after making money. They don't do this for nothing. And they're using a combination of that and the fact that we've got a lot of these consumer applications being used for government business, sensitive conversations, business communications with attachments going back and forth, and high value targets. And the user's metadata in those conversations, it's constantly exposed. It's being mined by AI. So you add in kind of the top layer of this, criminal ice cream sundae, if you wish. The cherry on the top is now we have AI, which is, making it just really easy for a criminal really to harness that data and use it for all of the things that they can. And it's kind of an arms race at that point. Users don't control their data. because that's how the free apps are making money. And that's kind of the last thing two more things we have to remember in this paradigm is those free messaging apps are making money off of you. You are the money. Your information is what they're selling. And so it's publicly available. And then you have on the last thing here is just human error. We saw that here in the US where, we had what was called Signalgate, where, a human actually just made a mistake, which of course we all do. So the cyber threat from this, the scope and sophistication, I guess, is increasingly becoming sort of easier for the target, for a criminal, a lot harder for you and I to really deal with those big campaigns that are hitting Asia, South Korea, Japan, and Australia, of course.
Okay, so this is really interesting. I want to get into this a bit more. So, because I love the way you're explaining it. Now, going back to the start of the interview, you were saying that, more Australians are like targeted. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think, we have to go back again to how industrialized really this is becoming for the attackers. Phones are now the center of daily life for Australians and the globe. But there are enough vulnerabilities in that attack surface where these exploits are kind of known. And again, those unfixable things become the easy targets. So where Australians bank and work and socialize, all of those things become sort of the perfect target. And what this really just means is those criminal groups are taking advantage of those new capabilities. And again, taking advantage of AI. We know that AI has brought this really different dynamic, and including Australia, which is attackers are able to impersonate people and change behavior that you wouldn't normally worry about it as an Australian citizen. As a mom, I know not to send money to someone I don't know. But if my daughter texted me and needed something, my guard is down as a human, right? So criminals are just using that AI to prey on human weak spots, your empathy. And of course, the same is true for the business world in Australia. Criminals are impersonating, CEOs, and then they're preying on the loyal employee to do what their boss says, which, again, they're just taking advantage of that empathetic person or the loyal person. And they're using these mobile devices to carry out these attacks. It's crazy. I mean, the Australian region isn't alone in this, but they absolutely are each in their own.
So would you say that perhaps people in the US market, North America market, are a bit more skeptical of those things if we're saying that there's definitely an increase in Asia Pacific and Japan?
I think the US has been dealing with it maybe just a little bit longer and are becoming, I guess, more immune to it. I mean, if you think about this, like, for example, you have here in the States, I don't know if Australia has this or not, but here in the States, we have all of these targeted sort of attack services, which are a text that is saying respond or it's hi and it's just empty, or it's, hey, we were supposed to meet at 6 and you didn't show up. Really what that attacker is trying to elicit is any response. They're just trying to see if the number is, if there's a human on the other side. And so I think you have a lot of fatigue here in the US with that, because I think that's how it started to roll out. And how that's rolling out in other areas of the globe, it's just a little bit newer. And so I think there's a lot of there's a learning curve that kind of has to happen, I think, as we grow immune to attackers. But, they always have the upper hand too. There's just kind of a new campaign they're going to start or a new way of doing it. And that's kind of a problem too. There's a pig butchering scam that are kind of stark examples of this, where the victims, quote unquote, are being fattened up with fake relationships and gains before being financially kind of slaughtered, quote unquote. That's kind of how that is. And attackers are really smart and they'll take advantage of culture. So the differences too from the US and places like the ASEAN region and Australia is that the culture here is different than it is there. And attackers really learn the area and the people and know what Australians might respond to versus what US people have grown accustomed to and sort of immune. And those are statistics that are run by these criminal organizations. So if one type of attack in the US started out as getting an 80% response, and now it's, a year later down to a 10% response, they won't use it anymore. But then they know that's a good one, and maybe they'll tweak it a little bit for culture in Australia and then take it there. So it really is a really thoughtful business, unfortunately.
The other interesting thing is now I'm an Australian, obviously living in the US. I got a US number now, and someone called me the other day and it had like scam call. You don't get that in Australia. So it's like automatically I was on the back foot. I'm thinking like, who's calling me up? I don't know that many people yet for my phone to ring all day. But that was something that I noticed, which was different. So in Australia, like, you get scam calls all the time, but it doesn't tell you. So that was something that I thought coming here, automatically I just screen the call. So I think that there are some more nuanced things as an Australian living in the US that I'm starting to notice that they don't have in Australia, which is probably case in point to a lot of things that you're talking about today, Christine.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. You and I are both reliant on a lot of infrastructure. Again, going back to just the basic connection of a mobile call, it's got to connect so many different places, and you're going from telco to telco to telco. And if you call me and you're in Florida and I'm in Texas, that isn't the same call route, obviously, if you're in Australia and I'm in Texas, that's going to take. But what you're talking about is you're dependent also on carriers and their involvement in how they're going to protect you from these calls. I also have that screening available to me where I can also set thresholds of what I'm willing to accept or not. I have mine set really high. All of mine are declined if I don't know who the caller is. And in other parts of the world, again, not only are they dependent on sometimes 2 and 3G technology and these outdated infrastructure that we know is exploitable, but then they don't have the sophistication at the carrier level either, or the government requirement for the carriers, frameworks and dependability on us to regulate this kind of stuff. It absolutely kind of a needed thing.
And this is where it gets interesting. So I've had a couple of interviews with your colleague, David Wiseman, in the past, and we've spoken a lot about mobile carriers or telcos more specifically. So you know how you were mentioning before, Christine, like it's really old and it's outdated infrastructure and it's insecurity with insecurity and it's spiraling. Is anyone sort of sitting back? I mean, obviously you are, but anyone in these telcos sitting back and going, we really need to think about if Christine's calling me from Texas into Australia, and how does that route look like? It's obviously going to be really outdated, really old school. Are people having these conversations? Because again, maybe there's more of a reluctance because then you put more money into it. And, businesses are businesses. No one wants to invest money if they don't have to. But again, to your point, do you think anyone's really sitting there at night going, I've really got to think about the infrastructure in our telco world?
Yeah, this is such a great question. So to answer your first question, yes, the conversations are happening. Even someone like myself, I am very close to a lot of these telcos. Obviously, BlackBerry, we've been doing this for 40 years. And, we are very used to working with telcos from back when we had, and carriers from back when we had handsets. There's deep, deep, deep relationships there. Again, including myself, we absolutely have these conversations. There's a few challenges, though, in that even if I were to go to my carrier, for example, on who my cell phone routes through, they don't own all of that. They're one cog in the wheel. So they own maybe like if I make a call or send a text or communicate on my mobile device, if you think about it this way, inside a handset, a phone, it's probably 200 different vendors' products in there, right? It's crazy. You have a supply chain that is really long, right? So you think about a phone call being made, it's the same thing. So while your carrier might own out of that, let's say it's 500 steps, the carrier might only own 15 of those. And so really, while they can go and say, hey, this is broken, they might only have the power to fix 10 things out of 100. It's not one issue. It's a lot of issues because all the infrastructure is shared infrastructure, right? It's not just the bigger carriers. I think that they do a lot, and they are doing a lot, like you said, on the front end of how to help consumers protect themselves. That is the one thing on the global stage I would like to see more of as a shared responsibility and a shared almost governance task is how are we looking to protect consumers as a global audience rather than a one carrier doing one thing and one doing something else.
So then I want to move on to sort of the behavior. So as you sort of mentioned before as well, like people are on our phones. I don't know about you, but I get the notification every Sunday around how long you been on your phone this week, Carissa? And it's a lot when I think about it. Apparently it's less than the average person on their phone. I think it's like 7 or 8 hours a day. And there's only 24 hours in a day. So that's quite a long time. That could almost supersede. So do you think that in your experience, given your role at BlackBerry, but also your pedigree in this space, are phones just something that's just been relegated? Everyone's talking about, the endpoint, the machine, the laptop, like everyone's talking about that. But even running this podcast of 350 plus interviews that I've conducted just on the show alone, haven't had a lot of people really talk about mobiles and the safety around that. Is it something that just gets relegated, would you say? Or where is people's minds at with this?
That's an amazing point, and you're right. And this really is the sort of the crux of why we're here. I think as an industry, we have gone so fast and furious from being on our laptops all the time to the majority of the things we do are now on our phones. That's a big difference. And that, we saw a lot of that shift, I think, during sort of the pandemic when people were starting to have to be remote and people started to work from everywhere. We saw a lot of that shift then. But really, what is happening is exactly that. You have, in a rich attack surface from a lot of attackers, taken advantage of a shifting industry and shifting technology that doesn't scale to what it was meant for, right? I mean, we weren't in the beginning of when we thought about how we used our phones and how this infrastructure was set up. I don't think anybody really thought we would be here doing these things from this device in our hand. And so it wasn't built to scale that way. So you're correct in that we are facing that as the challenge. And what is the answer to that? Well, I mean, my gosh, there's so many things we can talk about behavior and things that we know and things that we do. But I know that we won't be able to really deal with the criminal part of this and how we allow criminals to access this until we talk about the behavior. So if I'm a mom, and if I'm doing this today and I'm calling my daughter, I'm texting my daughter and I'm asking her to stop and pick up a loaf of bread on the way home. I mean, she's 18, she drives. Great. That's a conversation that I'm not concerned about. However, if I am a highly, risk government, that's a different conversation. And if we handle those and treat those the same as far as a privacy and a security realm, we're doing it wrong. And that's where I really see the need to shift the behavior away, is really to identify that your mobile device is an attack surface. And I think that the user, whether or not they're an employee or a government person or you or me or mom, when we open our laptop, we think about that endpoint protection. It's like you always are going to run like what we call quote unquote antivirus stuff, which I mean, different things to you, to me, but we don't think about that on our phones. And that's really where we have to start forcing that behavior change. Because again, no matter what the risk is in your using your mobile device, it is absolutely there. And attackers are it's becoming the more of a gold mine and low hanging fruit than now laptops are. So because, attackers are taking advantage of the fact that we aren't thinking about it. So I think it is that behavior shift that really needs to happen.
And then just to sort of extend this even more, I mean, I've spoken to people, even when I've worked at large corporations in the past, it's like, okay, well, here's your work phone and it's super restricted. You got 2 apps on there. Or you're running some form of MDM, but it's just super slow, right? So what happens when it's slow? People forgo it. They go back to their personal handset.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. And that is a challenge as old as time, is that if security hinders performance and efficiency, it will be bypassed. I mean, how many times you've been on your laptop and had to turn something off because it's doing the same thing? So I think it's really, 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 really critical, again, to take a step back and shift the mindset to productivity with security, something BlackBerry's talked about forever. We've always had to build in our security into being productive because we support the most security conscious governments and companies in the world, and they have to do work. So that is a big deal. But again, understanding that the tolerance levels for risk at some point have to be in a good place, and understanding where sovereignty and resilience needs to come into play there.
Selling SaaS to enterprise? You'll be asked about your security credentials sooner or later, likely before the contract's even signed. Vanta helps SaaS teams prove their compliance and frameworks like ISO 27001 and SOC 2 without losing months to manual prep. Visit vanta.com/KBcast. That's VANTA.com/KBcast to learn more. So then just talking about it a little bit more, I think I randomly got a text. I don't know whether it's on because I run a dual SIM, whether it's on my Australian line or US. Anyway, obviously it was some form of a scam. So I responded back saying like, yes, I didn't get a response, but I know it's more just around, trying to solicit some type of response to see, hey, is this person a target or not? But do you think, going back to the mindset, like people think, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to go on my phone because I'm traveling today, could get scammed. Do you think that people have that in their mind, or do they not think that this device potentially has so many issues attached to it? But again, we've sort of just grown up with like these devices literally being beside our bed every day. So it's sort of like, it's something that isn't going to be impacted by scammers? How does that mindset sort of go?
So I don't think that people actually wake up in the morning and grab their device on their nightstand and really think to themselves, like, what kind of messages am I sending right when I wake up? And it is a valuable point I think we should talk about, which is a little bit of the metadata that actually leaves the device every time you do that. So free messaging applications, and this is a known thing, it's not a secret. This is what I don't think people are thinking about. I want to walk through some of the data that's actually leaving the handset when you have those types of conversation. So when you use any kind of consumer messaging app where, again, you are the profit, your account information, your phone number, your profile name and your photo, your device information, the model and the operating system you're using, along with your usage data, the last time you were seen, the messaging timestamps, and the frequency and duration of how long you use that application. More importantly, your connection data, so your IP address, who your carrier is, your connection type, and your contact lists, your group messages, who you communicate with, how often, all of that kind of stuff, your location data, and thumbnail previews of files you send are all out for everybody to see. None of that stuff is yours. It is being bought and sold and traded and used by criminals to know where you are and know how to pursue you, really. That drives into the culture of an attacker. If they know your location and they know where you've been and they know you go to, and we see this in high value targets. So this is where the big government and the espionage comes in is if an attacker can tell where a really important person is having coffee every day at 4, there's a lot of information that, and who they're talking to every day at 6 o'clock, that kind of opens the door for a lot of attack surface. Now, you and I, again, I'm a mom. Maybe I'm not that high value target, but I am the high value target for scams. It's just how the attacker is going to make money. All of this kind of stuff just points to that open attack surface. And this is on the behavior side where people just don't think about that when they wake up in the morning. It's like, hey, I'm going to send this message. Somebody could be seeing who I'm communicating to. It's not the first thought most people probably have when they wake up in the morning. Maybe it's mine, but for the majority of it, I don't think most people are thinking about that.
That's valid, Christine. However, shouldn't the onus be, if we look at WhatsApp, so Meta owns WhatsApp, so would it be that, well, what are they doing about it? Where's their privacy sort of stance? Do you think, where's that conversation going on that front?
Well, I mean, great point, and that's how they make money. You've got this behind the scenes sort of discussion that I think a lot of security professionals have with a lot of governments and a lot of entities, and that how do we regulate that? But the reality is this is how these companies make money. It's you. So, until we can regulate that, it's going to be a losing battle. I mean, they're not going to regulate themselves. It's how they make money. So this is the point on the secure communication side is you really have to understand what conversations are okay for that type of audience and then what aren't. You're a high valued target government, highly regulated business bank or whatever. You shouldn't be having those conversations on those apps knowing those facts.
So going back to Meta for a moment before we move on, would you, and yes, that's how they make money. So would you say as well that going to criminals, obviously Meta isn't selling this data to criminals. They're selling it to retailers and getting information. This is maybe data they can collect on building reports for certain industries or whatever it may be. But are they cognizant that this is getting into the hands of criminals, which is then used to scam like our society, our citizens, our people?
I think we have to think about the chain of that and how that happens. So you're correct in that I don't believe any of these companies knowingly just say, okay, yeah, we're going to go sell all your information to criminals. That would be terrible. But they do sell them to advertising agencies. And have you ever gotten one of those letters in the mail that says, your company that you did business with was breached and all the records are now for sale on the dark web? This is kind of the same thing. If Meta's selling it to A-plus businesses who aren't doing their security homework and their security hygiene, and that company gets breached because an attacker says, oh, I know this is a main consumer of this data and I want that data, they're not going to go through Meta. They're going to go through these third-party agencies that are purchasing the data and they're going to breach them and then steal it. So that happens all the time. We know that. So I don't really think it's not that problem in itself is a tough one to solve in that, you're really up against an entire army of attackers knowing where they can get this data. And then they sell it between themselves, right? This is where you hear the terms of like the dark web and and hosting all these data. There's tons of spots for them to house and resell the data that they were able to steal for pennies on the dollar. But we know that's true for credit card information and personal identification information and phone numbers. And again, at the end of this attack chain, that's why you're getting the text messages, because some attacker was able to buy your phone number off of a list of available phone numbers, and now they're testing you out. And you mentioned before that, you replied to a message before. That is the case. Sometimes you won't hear back because they're just trying to verify you are, in fact, a number worth paying for. You will respond.
So then moving on to the behavior of certain things that should be sort of on perhaps like consumer messaging apps versus more secured environment. It's hard though. And look, I've spoken to your colleague about this before, David. It blurs the lines. Like often a lot of people message me on WhatsApp because now it's like, hey, KB, are you in Australia? Are you in the US? Which phone should I message you on, considering you have two numbers now? I don't know, but I've only got Chris's personal Australian phone number. So maybe I'll just message her that way, and I need to get to her because I don't know what time of the day it is, or she travels all around the world. And then sometimes it's like, okay, so is this person messaging me for work? Kind of, yeah. But then it kind of talks about, hey, how was your move over to the US? So it's kind of like, at what point is it like, all right, now we need to change because we're sort of now getting outside of, personal sort of stuff and moving more towards work sort of things? How do people make that demarcation and sort of cut the conversation, move elsewhere?
Yeah, that's also a great question. And I think we have to remember that free messaging apps will always have a place because they're convenient, they're available, and they're global. I can download one and communicate with you, like you just said, on the other side of the world for anything. So they're common. And that they're great because they've done a lot of, there's a lot of parts of society that they've done good. Think of all the parts of the world that wouldn't be connected if we didn't have access to this type of technology. So it's not a bad thing for everybody. However, they're not the place for sensitive government communications or infrastructure type of safety communications because they lack certified encryption, administrative control, again, control over that metadata, and then protecting against disclosure of that metadata. So I think if you can the behavior part of it is more like, if you're communicating with somebody that you don't mind know that metadata is out there and exists, then that's okay. And is that an okay decision to make? Of course it is. However, if you are a government entity talking about sensitive conversations, or you're a CEO or someone that works in a corporation where you're talking about the earnings report that's coming out, 2 days or whatever, not the place to be having those conversations. So I think it really is a behavior choice of knowing there are two ways to communicate on a mobile device and just accepting the fact that if you're going to use the first way, that your stuff's not private.
So, Christine, I want to ask more of a rudimentary question. So if you are a CEO of like a large corporation, like you're not an idiot, right? You didn't get there, like you're smart, you're educated, like you understand how things work. But is the behavior in terms of messaging or consumer messaging applications spiraled that far out of control that people at that level aren't even thinking, probably not just going to WhatsApp someone about like my company earnings for the year?
It was such a good question. So I think we need to take one step back before we answer that question and think about this just as a business. Global losses hit 1.3 trillion US dollars in 2024 from this. And in Southeast Asia alone, in Southeast Asia, these losses reached 23 to 35 billion or so, depending on who you ask. So this is big business. Second thing you have to remember is cultural differences. We talked a little bit about this, but remember in places like Asia, and I've recently had a fascinating conversations when I was traveling in parts of Asia about this. You have really, really, really strict leadership roles where they are answering these questions because culturally it would be a different problem for them if they didn't answer them in the US. So in the US, it's, acceptable to be skeptical. In parts of Asia, it's not at all. It's the cultural alignment is you answer questions because it's an authority figure versus in the US, you can just choose to say no. So I think criminals know all of this. They're very, very, very good at being really intentional. Then the third thing we're going to add on to this ice cream sundae is AI. So what is new to this ice cream sundae is the ability for attackers to use AI to generate something that is so real, and so close to being authentic that it's really a hard judgment call. And again, when they have all this metadata, they have all of that feeding this AI so they know where you were on Saturday, that who you're talking to. And so if they need to try and associate themselves with the CEO's got earnings tomorrow, and the CFO, he's waiting for him to call at 4 o'clock because the attacker knows he always calls at 4 o'clock. And this attacker has used AI to copy all of those things. That CEO might have a really hard time telling that it's not Bob, the CFO, because he gets the call from Bob, the CFO, every day at 4 o'clock. It sounds like Bob, looks like Bob. Why would the CEO question that? So I don't think it's a matter of these are the smartest people in the room. They are. Attackers are just as smart, and they have the upper hand because they have this technology that they're weaponizing to use this, again, all of these exploits that are freely available to have this great attack surface. We have a lot of stats in the US that we are tracking right now of CEOs this has happened to. There's some famous cases about people losing millions of dollars because, an attacker has done just what I said. They have created this massive game plan that takes thought. And these attackers are going after these big money transactions. They're not, in this scenario, it's how much can they make and how effective can they be? So the CEOs are still the smartest people in the room. They just are targeted with a lot more sophistication than they were 2 years ago.
Yeah, I get it. And you know what? I've actually interviewed someone else on the show recently, and he was sort of saying, like, we're talking about, oh, we got to give awareness and people have to be skeptical and all this sort of stuff. He's like, well, maybe we should just build better technology. So where does that sit with you then?
I think it's somewhere in between. Like, we're never going to eliminate this risk entirely because it is an arms race, right? So if it's going to take us 10 years to build all this new technology, where's the criminal advancement going to be in 10 years? So you do have to do kind of it's a little of this and a little of that. There is no silver bullet. I wish there was. And if there was, trust me, we would have it. I really do think it's part behavior and part sophistication and changing how we work, right? So again, I always go back, and when I'm counseling other companies or governments or talking to other security people, I always fall back on the principle of know your attack surface. If you are a highly regulated business or a government or doing crucial transactions that are life safety or confidential information, know that's an attack surface. It boggles my mind still that I have this conversation with some and they're not thinking about that at all. So you have that as just a really low-hanging fruit, easy thing to do. Do we need to upgrade technology? Of course we do. But is it the onerous on these companies and these governments and these for having these highly valued conversations to do something more than use a free messaging app? Yes, of course, right? That's part of it. So I think it's a little on both sides. Better technology, of course we need that. But ownership of the data that you need and whether or not that needs to be either sovereign or at least encrypted, that's a security and privacy are important in that. So I think it's a little of both.
And how would you say government is sort of approaching this, given security problems? Like there's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on at the moment. There's all sorts of things. So what's their sort of mindset towards this? To be like, we kind of need to keep these things a secret and we just can't be frivolously just messaging people, WhatsApping them. We always need to be skeptical in case someone is trying to impersonate someone else. These are real things that happen. But what's their take?
So I think a lot of things at the government level are happening, and a lot of things at the government level are happening globally. So if we take it from the very top, you've got a lot of governments sort of looking at how do we form some sorts of frameworks or belts and braces to deal with some of these attacks. That's not maybe specific to mobile, but it is specific to, AI and how we're looking at how the attackers are able to generate some of this. You do have some governments like the US, for example, did just recently released guidance on mobile conversations. So, and I believe that we were the first to do that. That needs to be happening a lot more. We do need a lot more governments to step in and just say, okay, this is an attack surface, at least for our highly regulated information. We need some belts and braces around security frameworks for how that should be handled. So we've got the start of that. But, that is really the most kind of recent, I think, things coming out of the industry in that. I will also say, though, that a lot of cross-pollination government talks are happening. I think when CISA released its last information, which was 80 plus countries, including Australia, were confirmed to have intrusions, and then over 600 organizations were compromised. with call logs stolen, location data stolen, unpatched systems. That was a joint FBI, NSA, CISA in that sort of effort. So I do think there is a lot of joint efforts happening. It's just going to be, again, how fast and how quickly can we get some sort of frameworks for guidance, or maybe not even regulation, but just guidance together. But I mean, again, the good news is the conversations are happening for sure, and they weren't a year ago.
So how quickly do you think that these things will be up and running? And I ask this because like government at times doesn't move the fastest, or even like big corporations can move slow as well. There's a lot of things to happen. But obviously this is a problem. There's big business in it. People are getting impacted by this. So do you think like maybe in a year's time when you and I have a conversation, this will move along quite substantially? Or how do you sort of see this playing out now?
Now that we have the sort of the firing over the line of the first guidance, we'll see a lot more. I think sometimes it just takes one government to put a stake in the ground to say, I'm going to put out some best practices. And generally, a lot others follow. So I do expect this to get a lot more traction faster. But again, that will just be the government and how it regulates sort of, or at least offers up guidance. And maybe it doesn't regulate it now. But I do think the guidance will happen quickly now. I'm hopeful. Some of the conversations as a company that we're in, I'm going to tell you governments are now taking this a lot more seriously, just even if it's not publishing guidance, a lot more seriously than they were a year ago. I'm having deeper conversations with governments I did not have a year ago that are now starting to see the outcome of this massive financial loss. And they're looking at two things. They're looking at one, how do I make sure my consumer base and my people are being protected, number one. But number two, how do I worry about my government secrets and things that shouldn't be available to others? So I do think the next year we're going to see, if you and I talk again, October next year, South by Southwest a year again, I do think we're going to see a lot more guidance. And, of course, we're here to help that. So however, we're offering to be involved and we are seeing some take us up on it. So we'll see how that goes.
Now, I know you are giving a talk at South by Southwest in Sydney, Australia, which I won't be at, so I won't be able to meet you in person yet. Maybe share a little bit more about what you're doing there.
So I'm speaking at South by Southwest twice, actually. On October 13th, there is a panel that I'm part of on leadership through transformation, which interestingly enough, sort of this topic is well to the forefront on really how do we help transform the industry being a corporate leader. I mean, BlackBerry's been securing communications for 4 years, and we know this is a tough problem to solve, but we know a lot about this. And we know a lot about the difference between a communication that needs privacy, where maybe some apps are good at that, but then where we need privacy and security, and where, our products like our BlackBerry Secure Suite really come in for these governments. So that's first. And then on the 14th, I'm presenting on this very topic alone, which is mobile espionage. I'm going to go through some of the things we talked about today, but more in depth on these attackers and sort of the campaigns that they're running and how that's really impacting sort of the local economy, and some best case scenario things on how to prepare for the next stage of this $1 trillion attacker campaign that I see, and like what I like to call my crystal ball. I'm going to do a little bit of crystal balling and do some future prediction stuff. But then also, again, what are the things and steps you should be taking as either a government or enterprise or a person to really protect yourself? So if there are listeners that are going to be attending South by Southwest Sydney, I would love to chat with you, meet you, and I hope you can come and see that presentation. It should be awesome.
So then just quickly on future predictions, anything you can share?
Well, I think the industry as a whole, with the $1.3 trillion target on its back, is going to see a lot more automation with AI. I think we're going to see a lot more attack surface with AI, and we're going to start to see government information colliding with other government information and secrets being let out that shouldn't. I've got some specific predictions on the personal, on the people front as well, but I think you're just going to see a lot more sophistication and speed. A lot of these things are going to become quicker, faster, cheaper, smarter for the attacker, and they're going to get their hands on a lot more data. So I expect to see some fireworks. And part of my prediction also will be around frameworks and guidance like we talked about with governments.
And lastly, Christine, is there any sort of closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
I think for just some final thoughts, the goal in this really isn't to eliminate risk entirely, because we're never going to do that. And, BlackBerry's always been front and center stage of doing tough security. And some of the things we bring into our products, I've been with the company a really long time. It's really tough. But what we really need to do is focus on resilience and sort of gaining control of that. We need to understand the difference between handing the keys to our national security story into free messaging apps, or, am I asking my daughter to stop and pick up bread on the way home from her friend's house? Different conversations. So my closing thoughts are really, we have to focus on that being the level of conversation, is really how do we take an industry and help people understand what they need to do with the conversations that they're having.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.